as well. All right, so Dr. Abbas Benmamoun is actually joining us today from Duke University in North Carolina, as you just heard, where he serves as the professor of linguistics, professor of Asian and Middle Eastern studies, and he also holds a leadership role of the vice provost for faculty advancement. And as you all know, probably his research focuses on comparative syntax and morphology of natural languages. And in the recent years, this has had a big focus on heritage languages, particularly on issues of language maintenance and loss within immigrant communities. And among a lot of notable articles in renowned journals, his publications also include the books The Feature Structure of Functional Categories, a comparative study of Arabic dialects, then the book titled Arabic Syntax, and also the Routledge Handbook of Arabic Linguistics. And also some of you know he's already associated with the Aqua Aurora Center, which we are really lucky about, and he's on the advisory board of the Input Project. And today he will be talking to us about heritage language research and its contributions to advancing syntactic research. And without further ado, we can have Dr. Abbas start.
Right, thank you so much for the invitation and for including me in your conversation about heritage languages. I still continue to feel like, you know, I am a pretender, so I feel more comfortable working in Arabic syntax and morphology. So I try to bring that lens to work on heritage languages, particularly Arabic in the diaspora. And I have really benefited greatly from working with colleagues who are experts in bilingualism, second language acquisition. So whatever I'm going to talk about today is really, if there is something interesting in it, the credit should go to also my collaborators. There are many of them, Maria Polinsky, Silvina Montrul, Abdelkafi Al-Berini, and many other people. And if there are any shortcomings, they are all my own. But what I want to talk about today is really just some reflections. This will be a talk where there is a lot of reflection. And it's about what are the takeaways from, at least from my own research and that of my collaborators on heritage Arabic with regards to syntactic theory. What can we take away from that? So I will be looking at the research that we have been doing and the results and see what they can tell us about the syntactic model that we have, or the models that we have. And I'll probably, if I have time, I will share with you some of the latest research that we have been doing. Abdelkafi Al-Berini and I have been doing on heritage Arabic, which is WH constructions, and particularly the issue of WH in situ versus WH movement. I'm not sure we'll be able to get to that, but we might. So I think I can share my screen. Let's see. Can you see everything?
Yeah.
So
your screen.
So this would be really like, you know, taking data from heritage languages and the results of research that we have been doing to engage some issues in syntactic theory. So as you know, syntax has really benefited greatly, especially generative syntax, from its research on a number of languages that represents the diversity of language families that are learned natively in their own native context. So for example, we know much more about the complexity of morphosyntax, let's say tense, agreement, systems, word order, case, WH constructions, anaphoric dependencies. If you look at, for example, generative grammar, and you look at, you know, our understanding over the last 50 or 60 years, you see, we know more. That doesn't mean that we have really strong, good accounts of those constructions, but we know more about the empirical generalization that we need to account for. So for example, any account for WH movement will have to take into account, let's say, WH constructions in Chinese, where you get WH in situ. If you look at agreement, you have to look at the agreement asymmetries in Arabic or agreements in Native American languages, where you get this kind of relationship between subject and object agreement. If you look at anaphoric dependencies, in addition to, let's say, research or generalizations within Romance or Germanic languages, you have to account for anaphoric dependencies in languages like East Asian languages, where you get long-distance anaphors and things of that nature. So we have more sophisticated understanding of the complexity of natural language that any syntactic model will have to account for. So as I said, we benefited greatly. So at least there is value, at least on a heuristic level, in the approaches that we have been doing. And in addition to that, our empirical base has been enriched by research on sign language, for example. Second languages learned by adults, and many of you here in this seminar today are experts on this, and you know this better than me. Research on contact languages, contact situations, and there is so much that we can talk about, selective language impairment, many things that we know much better by expanding the base beyond the ideal native speaker and here. So the heritage languages add another dimension to this. They also help enlarge the empirical base for all of us. So we need to take full advantage of it. At the same time, as we continue to sharpen the empirical generalizations, the generative approach, particularly its minimalist version, and they have been focusing on the model itself, sharpening that model itself. What do we mean by core syntax, for example? What are the core areas that we cannot do without, for example, to account for syntactic generalizations, the ones that I mentioned earlier? For example, the combinatorial system, let's say call it merge, both internal, let's say, for example, to let's say movement operations, where you expand the phrase marker by using what you already have in the phrase marker, or external, where you bring in something else to expand the phrase marker. And the features and unit that go into building those syntactic structures. And drive syntactic dependencies, the relationship between different positions and elements within the phrase marker. So at the same time, there is this parallel track of trying to refine the model further. So when you look at the contributions of research on heritage languages, and here the focus is mostly on formal aspects of language, there is also the social linguistics aspect, the pedagogical aspects, and all those things. For example, heritage languages have really pushing us to look more closely at L1 acquisition, particularly issues of input, what it means to be a native speaker. Is there a critical period? Those kind of questions. I think heritage languages and other areas as well have really put the focus in this area. What it means to do L2 and L3 acquisition, what it means for that. Bilingualism. What does it mean to be a bilingual? What is the relationship between the competing languages, if there is competition between them, of course? And what does it mean? What does it entail? And issues of language contact and change. And there is more to this, but there is a lot that heritage languages can contribute. So the research question that I want to explore here, and this is really, as I said, this is more, I am here kind of in a reflective mode on this, saying, let's take stock, at least for me, for working on Arabic, let's take stock of the findings that we have to see how we can, what kind of light those findings shed on the model. So what are the properties of heritage languages? And what do they tell us about current models of syntax? There is this tendency, and I know that many of you probably, of course, do not share it. So in addition to focusing on what is missing in heritage languages, because when we do work in linguistics and language acquisition, and I understand the scientific reason for that, you focus on what is missing, what is not there, the contrast and all those things. But also, we should also not forget to look at what is in there, what heritage speakers have been able to acquire and maintain, because those can be a window on the model itself. So we need to make sure that we are striking that balance in our approach to heritage languages, working on things that are not there, that are missing, for example, some marked constructions, more complex agreement relations and things like that. But there are things that do very well. And the question is that what that does tell us about merge, about agree, about movement, about all those things. So you know, so the hypothesis is that what if we use heritage language to test the theoretical model? And we can, at least here, I will focus on two aspects of the model. One is its architecture, the architecture of the model. And the other is, of course, its components and tools. Phrase structure, let's say we're talking about the generative system or systems, phrase structure, lexicon, features, mechanisms to capture local and dependencies and dependencies at a distance, null categories and things like that. So those are the two areas that I will look at. So for example, if we put the lens on the minimalist program, the architecture is to some extent driven by conceptual necessity. Every model of linguistics has to have a sound sign part, the modality, and also the meaning part. So this is the Saussurean sign, basically, a pairing language as being a pairing of sound and meaning. So that's those we have. We have LF, or the conceptual component, and we have the PF and the morphophonological component. But we need a system that builds the inputs to those two components. And the question is that what is the nature of that system? And the approach within minimalism is that we should have a stripped down system of syntactic components. Now, of course, that's in the eyes of the beholder, what stripped down system means. And if we simplify one area, you are more likely to end up making other areas more complex. This has been always the case, where the complexity should reside. There is a more robust role for interfaces. And this is going to be critical for heritage languages, because this is where you see, when we talk about what is missing, this is where you see those major differences between heritage speakers and non-heritage speakers when it comes to mapping to the interface. We see that in many areas, in phonology and morphology and in syntax. I'll talk a little bit about that. So some syntactic notions that we will be engaging. So question, for example, how linguistic expressions are put together? What are the basic building blocks to build linguistic expressions, phrases, sentences, even words? The relationship between the members of the phrase marker, the constraint and principle that govern those relationships. And here, this is critical, the correspondence relations or mapping between syntax and the semantic and phonological interfaces. So how can heritage language inform the debates? So here I will focus on three things: external merge, internal merge, and a category of roots, the roots. As you know, there is a lot of debate now in syntax about the nature of linguistic expressions and categories, how we build those categories. And the idea here is that there is a significant role to be given to roots. And as Marant and many others said, is that, you know, Semitic languages can be really a good area to test this idea of the root, the centrality of the root. And I will talk about that. And actually the findings from heritage languages are really encouraging. And I'd like to get your input on this. And also the issue of markedness, especially when it comes to issues of default. What is the, you know, because there seems to be a tendency to gravitate towards more default unmarked patterns, but it is a more nuanced than that, as we are going to see with Arabic morphology. Yes, we got heritage speakers seems to favor the unmarked, the default pattern, but it is the internal default pattern of the language, and that's what we would expect sometimes being the universal default, which is very interesting by itself, as we will see. So those are the three areas that I will look at based on Arabic data and results that we have so far. So when you look at phrase structure, so merge. So this is an area where heritage speakers, Arabic heritage speakers, seem to pattern quite closely with native speakers, as we have seen. The heritage speakers of Arabic, for example, they acquire the word order of Arabic, the SVO, VSO order, for example, the non-phrases. I will show you that in a minute. And this has been shown to be in a number of languages. You are going to find differences. For example, it depends on the options that you have with regard to word order. But in general, if you have an unmarked word order, they are going to acquire it and maintain it, as you will see. So for example, let's look at this in Heritage Arabic. This is data from Heritage Arabic. So when you look at this, this is almost like, you know, when I was looking at these constructions, I was like, this is almost like looking at syntactic structures from Chomsky, where you have that how one of the great pieces of evidence from the model that Chomsky was developing in the 50s was really that kind of like serial dependencies that you have between auxiliaries, models, and verbs, where the preceding element determines the features of the next element, which determines the features of the next element. I have been reading, for example, and you can expand that. And and that's really very complex to do, because there are some, you know, the sequencing, and there is the selection, and there is the dependency that is involved in that. So when you look at, for example, an Arabic sentence like the one here, and this is from a heritage speaker, you find that in Arabic, you have to have the tense preceding the model, which in turn precedes the main verb. And the forms of those three elements, you know, each one depends on the next one. And when you look at, and the main tense is carried by the top verb. The top element in the sentence is it's like English. And the main verb has to be in a particular morphological form, which is itself can be very complex, because it is a discontinuous form. So its morphology is quite complex. And when you look at the adjective follows the noun. It is not like English. And here I'm talking about heritage speakers, I'm talking about heritage speakers in the American context, North American context. So for example, if you look at this sentence, and I don't know whether you can see my cursor here. So this is the, you know, I tried to code them with colors here. So this is the verb that is carrying tense. This is the modal verb, and this is the main verb. And here, this is the prefix on the main verb. And what you see here is that they get the sequencing right, they get the dependencies right, they get the word order right. And when you look at the adjective and the noun, it's the same thing. Agreement may be off, but the sequencing is right. So in this, and this is actually, you can duplicate it across. We collected narratives, we elicited data, and you see that the word order in general is really intact. There are differences because Arabic gives you the option of both VSO and SVO, and there is a tendency to gravitate towards an SVO order more than the VSO order. But that may also be dialectal variation, because Egyptian Arabic itself is tending towards more SVO order with the native speakers. And this goes to a point that Jason and many other people have raised about heritage speakers. We need to make sure that we know what the baseline is, and we know what variety the heritage speakers have acquired. I think that is a critical point that we need to keep in mind. When you look at the noun phrase, it's the same thing. It's the same complexity. Adjectives follows the noun in Arabic. Adjectives agree with the noun in definiteness and in gender and number. Genitive constructions in Arabic are head initial. And the head of the genitive construction does not carry the definiteness marker. This is the famous construct state that well known in Semitic and Arabic and Hebrew and other Semitic languages, where you get this kind of dependency that includes definiteness. So the definiteness of the construction is really the definiteness of the whole thing. So it's almost like there is some kind of propagation of features. And that's where you get differences between native speakers and heritage speakers, as you see in these examples. Again, the sequencing is not an issue. Taking a noun and merging it with another noun, taking a noun with an adjective is not an issue. For example, here you see the adjective in these two sentences, and there is agreement in the adjective and the noun here. The noun and gender agreement of the sequence in the word order is not. And when you look at the construct state, and this is like the genitive construction, you find again the head is initial. It is head initial in both cases. Now the main differences here between heritage speakers and native speakers is that in this here, where in Arabic and Hebrew, only the last noun, the last member of the construct states can carry definiteness, and the entire construction is analyzed as definite or indefinite, depending on the definiteness feature of the last member of the construct state. What you find with heritage speakers, with some of them, is that you find this propagation of features. Now, one can interpret this in different ways. One is that they are getting the right word order, but the agreement dependencies are really not the same as native speakers. This is where, so that mapping from, let's say, from the syntax to PF, if that is where agreement is spelled out, that's where things become a little bit different from native speakers. But there's another way to look at this in terms of markedness. So if, for example, in Arabic here, what I argued in some of my work is that the construct state, and this is the same thing that Hagit Borer and many other people have said, the construct state behaves almost like a single word. Okay, it is kind of like a prosodic unit. And the idea here is that those features, the reason why you get, I argued, the reason why you have definiteness in only one of them, it's almost like when you have this restriction that says you only need one affix to express a feature. You don't need to have duplication of affixes to express features on each each member of the prosodic unit. And that was the analysis I proposed to say why we need only one. Now, the question is that for heritage speakers, and something that we haven't tested, is that, is this a prosodic unit within heritage Arabic or not? So this is really a question for PF. What is the PF status of this complex in heritage Arabic? So these are the things that we need to tease apart when we look at heritage Arabic, for example, and heritage languages. Which things are present? Well, what you see here, what is present is really the ability to combine elements, to merge them and form complex linguistic expressions, sentences, and phrases. What is really different from native speakers is the relationship between the members of those linguistic expressions, phrases, and sentences, and whether, you know, the agreement dependencies, and also the prosodic status at the PF interface. And those are issues of the interface, if agreement is itself an interface issue. So this is this part on phrases and sentences. I want also to talk about very quickly about relative clauses. And this is really relying on the work of Maria Polinsky and others, and also some of the work that we did on the heritage Egyptian and Palestinian Arabic. Again, when you look at relative clauses in heritage Arabic, you find that the heritage speakers pattern with the baseline, with native speakers in having the right sequencing of formation of relative clauses. They don't have a lot of challenges forming the relative clause. So you get that kind of like, you know, the noun followed by the relative clause. Now there is a complexity in Arabic that we found with the construct state with the noun phrase. And that is in Arabic, there is a definiteness restriction or relative clauses. So whether you are going to have definite relatives with an overt marker or not. And there is a difference in Arabic. You don't have one when it is indefinite, you have one when you are definite. And here, you find a difference between heritage speakers and the native speakers. So again, the sequencing is a right, but it is that restriction about definiteness, like what we saw with the construct state. That is where you get differences between heritage speakers. And as you know, heritage speakers, there is a huge differences between individuals here. So these are really kind of gross generalizations. But we do find this difference in terms of agreement and definiteness on the relative clause. Another interesting thing that you know, when you look at this is from the work of Polinsky, is that when she looked at the comprehension data, and what she found is that, you know, heritage speakers of Russian did well or relative clauses, particularly the relativization of subject and objects. But there is stronger performance relativization of subjects, which is interesting because it seems to be consistent with the accessibility hierarchy of Keenan and Comrie. And this hierarchy has been actually confirmed on many languages. If you are going to relativize the object, you are likely to relativize the subjects as well, and you go down the hierarchy. But here she saw that there is a preference for subject. So when I was looking at this, I said, that's really interesting because in syntactic theory, we give them different labels, but subjects have always had a privileged position in syntactic theory. Whether it's, for example, when you look at the LGB framework, Lexis and Government and Binding Framework, you find actually that the subject has an extremely privileged position there in syntax. The extended projection principle and all those things where the subject is relevant. But even in the minimalist incarnations of the model, you find that the subject is relevant. The subject is really the one that ends up, checking the features of tense and the elements that are high up in the phrase marker. So this idea that this element, that is the external argument in the sense of Williams, has a more privileged role than other arguments in the sentence than other non-phrases in the sentence, seems to be also confirmed here when you look at relative clauses. So there is something there about that, the primacy of the subject, the primacy of this element that is the external argument that enters into dependency relations with tense and even with the complementizers and others. So it satisfies the subject properties. It satisfies the checking of features of the various function categories I showed in some other work, that even negation, if we assume that it has some kind of category features, it ends up being checked in Arabic by the subject. And we see that because some negatives agree with the subject in Arabic. And so this idea seems to be also to track what we found with relative clauses. Now I have to say that this is extremely tentative and needs to be checked more carefully. So I am not really yet confident about this, but I just want to share it with you and invite your feedback on it. But I just thought that was interesting. When you look at that construction, we see that in fact the subject has this privileged status that keeps recurring in various aspects, whether it is in control structures, whether it is an anaphoric dependencies, when you look at subject orientation. There is this thing about subjects, and I would love to see more research on heritage languages that sees whether subjects have that kind of distinct status relative to other grammatical relations. An additional note, final note, and this is again, if that one was tentative, this is even more tentative. And I wasn't sure this is ready for me to put forward, but let me put it out there. When you look at relative clauses, there are at least two competing analyses that go back many years, many decades actually. They go back to the work of Jean-Roger Vernillon and Brain. And this is the idea of what is the proper analysis for relative clauses. Is it a promotion analysis? Or will you end up basically moving the noun to a peripheral position? Or is it a matching analysis where you get some kind of operator that establishes that kind of relationship between the relativized noun and the empty position, or a position within the phrase marker? This has been really the debate within, and there has been a revival of the promotion analysis recently. So I thought, okay, what do heritage languages, can heritage languages tell us something about this debate within the minimalist program about the proper analysis for relative clauses, or at least the analysis that may be closer to what we find in various languages. And there are different arguments for the promotion analysis, including idiomatic expressions and things like that. Now, when you look at the promotion analysis and the matching analysis, they are both highly complex derivations there, because if you just look at them, they look simple there on the slide, but actually there's a lot of complexity involved, because you have to establish a dependency between something on the periphery of the clause and then something lower in the clause. There is some kind of movement operation or some correspondence rule that you have to establish And the matching analysis, you have to add an extra element that is an operator in the clause, and to make sure that the operator is really has a relationship between the relativized noun and the rest of the clause, and that you get the right interpretation. But when you look at what we find with heritage languages, we find that, as we saw with Arabic, is that there is no problem building up basic structure, noun phrases, sentences, getting the sequencing right. What we find is that the challenge that we find with heritage languages is establishing dependencies at a distance. We have seen that, and people have found that also with anaphoric dependencies, like in the work with Kim and others. So my tentative or my suspicion here is that that's probably better to call it that way, is probably that the promotion analysis is a better option than the matching. The matching analysis is a better option for relative clauses in heritage languages. So that has to be really looked at. But this is what I see. Heritage languages can be extremely, really informative with regard to debating syntax. What is different about heritage languages? Again, you see this thing about interfaces, about agreements, about mapping, about correspondences, and things like that. And we find some syntactic generalizations that have been captured through highly complex correspondence or movement operations. And the question is that really consistent with the finding that we find with heritage languages? Now, of course, the devil is always in the detail. What I might call simple, somebody may say that's actually itself is complex when you look at it, when you unpack it, and that's a fair point. So this is all tentative, but I tend to be a little bit more on the side of, like, the simpler the better, not in a naive way, because it is not simple when you talk about construct state or economic sentences with sequencing of various verbal categories. That's not a simple structure. That's a highly complex structure. But in terms of what added complexity do you want to have? So, for example, if you look at some work within minimalism and within generative syntax, you find that some of them really deploy highly complex operations. So, for example, here, the verbal complexes in the work of Zaborchi and Koopman, or how, for example, Chlonsky derived the Semitic construct state, where you get this kind of phrasal movement, many iterations of phrasal movements. And you find the same thing with the anti-symmetry model of syntax of Kane, where you get, let's say, this kind of universal schema, and therefore in other, let's say, for example, to derive the head finality of the head final order in some languages, you have really to introduce some highly complex syntactic operations. But when you introduce those highly complex syntactic operations that sometimes do not show up in default patterns in the language, then the question, and then you need some kind of dependency to keep track of the structure of the derivations. And the question is that compatible with what we find in other kinds of dependencies, like the anaphoric dependencies, the relative clauses, the interpretation of relative clauses, the agreements, things that we find with heritage languages. Is that compatible with that or not? My suspicion is that it is not, and therefore we need to really take a second look at this. The whole issue of what is a basic word order. I think this is almost like going back to the LGB framework, saying that there may be some basic schemas and that people are able to learn them, actually, and conversion them. And it seems that, in fact, when we come to Arabic morphology, we will see something along those lines. The morphology is complex, but heritage speakers can acquire it, and acquire even something that is an internal default pattern within the language. So again, these are more like speculations at this point, just that heritage languages can help us shed further light on the critical debates within syntactic theory. So the benefit can go both ways, because there is a tendency in some of our approaches to take the model as it is and say, okay, this is confirmed by heritage research or L2 research and things like that. I think, and as some people have been doing, is we should also try to go in the other direction as well. What did they tell us about the models? Like what we do, did they tell us about what it means to be a native speaker? Or what is the proper input? Is there a critical stage for language acquisition, and all these questions that are so important? Okay, so I know that we don't have lots of time and I still have quite a bit to go, so I'll go very quickly here. So I just said that what I have in this slide. So the pattern that emerged is that heritage speakers of Arabic, at least, they converge on the baseline grammar. So basic structures. And it's not a question of, transfer from the dominant language. English is so different in all the constructions that I talk about from Arabic. The construct state, the sequencing of adjectives and nouns and all those things, the relative clauses, and there are significant differences. And therefore, this is really just heritage speakers converging on the baseline. And these are, I think these are significant. And I'm not saying anything different from many people in this seminar here who are present here have done and have shown more adequately than what I have done here. Okay, internal merge movement, and I try to move here very quickly. And I really recommend a paper by London here. He's in the seminar here, and he can shed more light on this. But when you look at movement, this is a chapter. This is that paper that I mentioned. There is in the chapter of the volume, edited by Polinsky and Sylvina Montrol on heritage languages. And some of the stuff that I'm talking about here is going to be in a chapter in that volume. V2, for example, we find it, but it is in a more nuanced way. We find it in heritage languages. And also, when we look at Egyptian Arabic negation, we find that movement is really there, but in a very interesting way. So let me talk quickly about that. Now, I don't know how much you know about the work that has been done on Arabic negation, but Arabic negation is almost like French negation. There is this sandwich, what people call the negative sandwich, where you get a verb in between two negative markers. It's almost like this is the ne and this is the pa, majaj. But what is interesting in Arabic, it's almost like French. In French, you can say ne pas, and then usually a non-finite verb. This is basically Pollock, 1989, and you see this in Arabic here. So mish, for example, this is not a verb. So you get this kind of like no sandwich. Mish as one marker, like here. But when you have a verb like a past tense verb, you have to have the sandwich. The verb has to come in between. When you have a present tense verb in Egyptian Arabic, you have the option to put the verb in between or not. Okay? So to summarize, because this is going to be critical, past tense, absolutely you have to have it. Though there may be a dialect of Egyptian Arabic that's some people say, the Sharqiya dialect, that may not be the case. But we need to look at the data more carefully. Because sometimes if you have meta-linguistic negation, it's a different kind of realization of sentential negation. When you have a present tense verb, you can have the sandwich or you don't need the sandwich. When you have a non-verbal predicate, you have this, the mish. Now, Moroccan Arabic is different. In this situation, only this one is possible in Moroccan Arabic, not this one. The option only exists with nouns and adjectives in Moroccan Arabic. Now, quickly, the way I derived this, and many other people have derived it, to say this indicates that there is movement. It's almost like a Pollock. There is verb movement in here. There is verb movement in here. There is no movement, at least not up to negation. And there is no movement in here. Okay? So, quickly, movement in the past tense, obligatory. Option to have movement in the present tense. No movement when you have a non-verbal predicate. I am grossly simplifying the data, but we try to test this with heritage speakers. But first, let me show you what we found with heritage speakers. Arabic negation, and there is a lot of evidence that negation is above the tense phrase in Arabic. There's strong evidence for this. There's almost a consensus now. I was one of the people who was wrong to assume that it was like English, with tense phrase above the noun phrase. And then but I think other people have suggested that it's really like this one, and I agree with that, and actually even wrote a paper with colleagues providing additional arguments for this kind of structure. Now, this structure is different from English. And what we found with heritage speakers of Arabic is that they converge on this structure, no problem. So this is, again, this goes back to the phrase marker, that they really converge on this at the lexical level and the functional level. They converge on that. Now we want to see what they do, and there is more in a paper that we did in 2014 and 15 on negation that you might want to look at. How they do on negation, and you know, they do all right. I mean, they do fine. I mean, they manage to capture that, for example, in the future tense you don't have, because it is nominal, non-verbal predicate. So you get this mesh. In existential construction, this is not a complication in Arabic. You get the sandwich with noun and preposition and stuff. There is no sandwich, and you get it all right. You find a little bit here on the present tense and imperative. Now, when you look at the past tense, you find that heritage speakers in general, they do okay. So this is the sandwich here, when there is this dash between the ma and sha. So they do okay on the movement operation here. So they are really, they are deploying movement. But when you look at the present tense, then we see interesting differences, okay, with heritage speakers. As I said, remember, in Egyptian Arabic, it is kind of optional, though there is a tendency to prefer the movement option rather than the non-movement option, which is very interesting in the debate about what is really the marked one. Is it the movement or no movement? And here it goes to debate about economy and a lot of things that we can discuss if you want. But what is interesting about this is that when you look at heritage speakers, they prefer the non-movement option over the movement option. And that is a really, I wasn't expecting that actually. It was really interesting to see. That's why when you get the option, they prefer the non-movement option. I showed you the past tense. So why is that? Well, let me just provide some take on it. Now, for some syntactic reasons, really, I think the non-movement option should be the preferred option. For language internal reasons, in some of my work, I have argued that actually there is no, in the present tense in Arabic, there are no features that drive verb movement. So, I provided the number of arguments for that, unlike the past tense, and I called them verbal features, like Chomsky 1995. But the idea is that the expectation is that there should not be movement. But in Arabic, we do have movement. In my dialect, Moroccan Arabic, we do have movement in the present tense. So but I really think that is really more like a generalization of the movement operation to the present tense as well, because it is kind of pervasive in other forms where you have to have movement, like the imperative, like existential, and like the past tense. So it seems to me like the movement option in the present tense, from a linguistic point of view, from a syntactic point of view, it is a marked option because there is no verbal feature driving that movement. And it seems like the heritage speakers have converged on that, on the unmarked option, though it is the marked option that is preferred in the language. And this is one interpretation I have of this data, that in fact, this is really an interesting, if it holds, it is an interesting finding by itself, that the heritage speakers seems to be converging. Actually, the arguments are right. Namely that they have decided, okay, they have figured out that the present tense really should not be driving. There is nothing that drives verb movement in the present tense, and therefore the verb should stay in situ or below negation, and there is no merger negation, so we don't get the sandwich. Whereas native speakers, maybe through input and more extensive input from in various contexts, including imperative contexts and other places, where they really basically, it's almost like overrode the marked option, the unmarked option, and went with the marked option. That's one possible interpretation, but that needs to be looked at very carefully. But the main thing is that they have converged on the movement operation in the present tense. So the movement is there in heritage languages. And I just said that earlier. So let me just, because we need to get to the roots, and also would like to engage you with some questions and get your input as well on what I have been saying. So heritage speakers deploy movement in general. Internal merge, and this is movement, is relatively intact. It's close to the baseline, but they deviate from the baseline when movement is the marked option. Again, this has to be checked. Here I can mention the work that we are doing on WH movement. And this is where heritage Arabic can be really interesting, because Arabic dialects differ from each other. Some of them deploy the movement option as the unmarked option, and some of them have the WH in situ as the unmarked option, which is Egyptian Arabic from the work of Wahda and the others, who showed that Egyptian Arabic is really almost like Chinese, and you have the in situ movement. You have the in situ option. You have movement, but it is really the marked option relative to the in situ option. And we, Kafi Alberini and I are looking at it. Actually, we are analyzing the data as we speak. And what I can tell you, I can share with you that is that actually they define on WH in situ. It's also close to the baseline, but there are some nuances in there. Again, like what we do find with heritage languages, but they do converge on the in situ option as well. So that is by itself as an interesting finding. In other words, I mean, they do really converge on how you establish the kind of dependencies in the clause between the operator domain and the lexical domain. How you, if the language deploys between the functional domain and the lexical domain. If the language deploys movement, like we see with the verb movement, with verbs and tense, they deploy movement. If there is optionality, they go with the unmarked option. In WH movement, if there is in situ, they deploy the in situ and they find a way to do the question interpretation with the right scope. That has to be checked because we haven't looked at interpretation. We looked only at production, and that's really will be critical for us to make sure that they are getting the right scope and the related ambiguities that you get when you introduce other elements like quantifiers. So this is very quickly on movement roots, and this is the one that I'm really excited about. It's what is the nature of lexical categories in generative grammar, and this has been really a debate that goes all the way back to the 60s with the aspects of the theory of syntax, and the one idea that is getting some traction is that the root is really one basic unit of formation. Now that has to be unpacked and analyzed more closely what we mean by root, what is the root, the role of the root in morphological systems and things like that. There are lots of things that we need to look at, with the semantics of the roots, and all those things need to be looked at. But Semitic languages have always been recognized as really languages that bring this to the fore more clearly, more explicitly, because there is really a stark role for the root in deriving correspondences between lexical items. The root is to be essential. This goes back centuries to the Arab grammarians, but also from the great work that Michael Brain did, and also John McCarthy and others. Here are some things like when you look at the roots. So Arabic, as you know, has these systems: concatenative, non-concatenative. But if you want really to derive an Arabic word, you need three things, at least. You need the ability to extract and isolate the root from the base word. So to zero in on the root when you get it. You need to understand what is the appropriate template for the relevant derivation. For example, is this a causative verb? Is this a plural noun, or what have you? And the other thing is that you need to know the rules that govern the mapping from the root to the template. So you need to have a computational system to do that kind of correspondence between the root and the lexical and the template. So to give you a quick example, Arabic has as I said, Arabic has two types of derivations. You get the one like English and French and other languages, nothing really complex. You get a base noun, mudir, director, and you attach a plural noun to it. Now, this is a masculine plural, or you attach this one if it is a feminine, mudira, mudirat. Nothing here that is complex, but pay attention to this mudirat. This is the feminine, but this is the one that is going to be used as default in Arabic. This is what I was talking about earlier, about that there is an internal default in the language, and the internal default in the language is really the feminine plural. Okay, this is very in the plural domain. Okay, not the masculine, as you see in some languages where you get the masculine pattern as the default pattern. That's really critical. Because when we look at L2 learners and heritage speakers, they are going to deviate here. So I can give you that before we get to it, so that you hold it in your mind, is that heritage and non-heritage speakers, L2 learners, they use this one as some kind of default. When they don't know what to do with the plural, they attach this morpheme, the masculine one. Heritage speakers, actually, they nail it. I mean, they go for this feminine as the default pattern in the language. That's really an interesting finding, I think, that we were able to find. The non-concatenative one, the celebrated one, the root and pattern system, is when you cannot isolate a small part and say this is where the plural morpheme is. It's really the vocalic template melody that gives you the plural pattern. So madrasa, school, madaris. You see this long vowel here. Those, some people, I agree with that there is some kind of plurality marker in this long vowel here. And this is another line of research that I have been doing, looking at Arabic morphology and saying whether, in fact, these vocalic melodies mean something or not. But we can discuss that some other time. I'd love to have a discussion about that. When you look at the plural, we call these broken plurals. This is actually a term that goes back to the Arabic grammarians from over 12 centuries ago, where you get different patterns. But the dominant patterns, and this goes to the work of McCarthy and Prince, what is called the iambic pattern. And this is where you get this kind of short syllable followed by a long syllable. This seems to be like almost the basic. When you look at the sound plural, like this one, this is the kind of like the default pattern. But when you look at this one, it seems to be like this kind of iambic, CV, CV, CC, VV, VC, or this one here, CV, CV, VC, long vowel following a short syllable. Okay, just to give you the preview, heritage speakers converge on the iambic as the kind of default for broken plurals, which is really remarkable when you think about it. And we go through the analysis and our work of that. The other complication in Arabic is that when you have a long vowel in the singular and you have a broken plural, you introduce a glide. And if you want to know more about this, you can look at the paper, really great paper, 1990 by McCarthy and Prince on broken plurals in Arabic. So you get sorry, I'm getting phone calls here. So you get this kind of insertion of a glide. The other thing is that when you have a geminate consonant in the singular, you break up the geminate. So the integrity of the geminate is violated. It's broken. And you introduce this long vowel that you usually introduce in the plural here between this, you break up the geminate. Now, to give you again to a preview of the paper, and invite you to look at it, this is where heritage speakers struggle. Introducing the glide, breaking up the geminate. So they get the broken plural, they get the iambic pattern, but their grammar, their word formation is different from the baseline when it comes to dealing with these long vowel bases and these geminate consonant. That's where really they struggle. Well, struggle, I mean, they are different. That's the proper way to characterize it. So there is this interesting thing here, and this could be, again, this could be the realization at the PF interface. This could be more like some kind of interface. Think of how we look at these complex the glides, how we look at the geomet consonants and things like that. That could be really what is going on. The conversion on the template, the conversion, the notion of root, but they have, the knowledge is different from native speakers when it comes to those things. So again, the heritage speakers, they have, they converge on the system. They converge on the sound feminine plural as the kind of base form, and they converge on the iambic template. I'm not sure I have a lot of time here because I know that you need to get to the question period. But I think I gave you a preview. So the last one, and this is really, I think this is really an interesting finding. When the heritage speakers deviate from the baseline in the non-context, they deploy the iambic pattern. They really go to the broken plural, not just, we found that heritage speakers, sometimes they may give you the sound plural and use the default feminine pattern when you expect the broken plural, the internal modification of the root. Or they give you the iambic pattern, which is the internal template, the root and pattern system, which really means that they have converged in the notion of a root. They have converged in that notion, and they are deploying and they converged on the notion that the iambic pattern is really the basic pattern in the language, the default pattern in the language, the unmarked pattern in the language. And they deploy it, sometimes, differently from the baselines. For example, the baseline may have a different pattern that might not be iambic, but they deploy it. They deploy it in the heritage speakers. They deploy the right iambic pattern, and that is really, really remarkable. Meaning that in fact they can extract the root and they can map it on a template. So the notion of the root is there, and that seems to be consistent with the recent debate within the minimalist program, that there is something to the notion of a root in the language. That the root may have some linguistic reality. It is not a psychological reality to establish connections between lexical items, but it has really a linguistic reality. What I mean by linguistic reality or grammatical reality is that you can use it and refer to it to account for linguistic generalizations. And that seems to be the case here with heritage speakers, that they converge on that notion of a root. And the last thing I would mention is that what I said earlier is that is the use of the sound and the plurals, and I said this already. They really converge on the default pattern, which is the sound feminine rather than the sound masculine. The thing is that for you to know about Arabic morphology, the sound masculine is reserved for human nouns. So there is a semantic restriction on this, and L2 learners struggle with that one. So they take it and generalize it to non-human nouns. Heritage speakers seem really to get it. They know this is really sound plural is really kind of marked pattern in the language. The sound feminine is the unmarked pattern, and I'm going to generalize it to even forms that get the broken plural. I'm going to generalize this. And this is actually was found by children as well for research on L1 acquisition, that children also generalize the feminine pattern of the language. So there is some convergence here with L1 with the L1 language. So so they converge on the root as the basic pattern. So just to conclude here, and there is more, as I said, these are more like reflections rather than really ironclad results that I would be confident about defending, though we need all to have keep an open mind and keep refining the work that we do. But the picture that emerges is that heritage learners are able to converge on core areas of the grammar of the baseline. They seem to be able to acquire the basic phrase structure of the language, the word order, and the dependencies between the members of the phrase marker, and including head movement, whether it is syntactic or morphophonological. The areas where they are different from the baseline are things of morphosyntax. and as many people here, Jason, as many others know, is that that's really the areas where we have found differences, agreement aspect, cases, phonological realization of the roots. Those we have found what some people call vulnerabilities, but and these are areas where you are really looking at the interfaces, including interfaces with the semantic components. For example, we have found differences, and O'Grady has found the differences with quantifier scope, for example, negation and things like that, binding and negation. So one tentative conclusion that we can draw from this is that phrase structure, word order, movement, and the root as basic units of derivation and representation probably do not require extensive input and exposure to the language, because native speakers, heritage speakers, seem to converge on them quite early with more constrained input. And this is not to say that minimalism is fine and everything is good. There are some questions there that are raised about the complexity of derivations that we have, the correspondence rules that we put in place, the extensive movement operations that we have in some analysis that we need really to take a close look at to see how they check out when we look at heritage languages and other languages as well. But it is worthwhile for theoretical linguists to incorporate heritage languages in their empirical base. We need to widen the empirical base beyond what we call the ideal native speaker, of the language, because there's so much that we can learn from these speakers who are remarkable. And again, I would urge all of us, when we look, and you do this, I'm sure, when we look at heritage speakers, to always look at, to also focus on how they have been able to maintain and acquire these languages in a different context where there are other pressures on them not to acquire those languages. And that is a remarkable thing to do. But it is remarkable for us as linguists who are trying to understand what it means to know a language. So I'll stop there. I'm sorry, I went probably over time here.
I don't think most of us mind. Thank you so much. We will give you a very silent emoji applause. Yeah. Thank you so much for your talk. And after the applause, let me actually see the people. We should
let me take the slide down. I stop sharing, but I can always put them up so that we can see each other.
Okay, great. Yeah, okay. Jason raised a hand to ask a question. You can go ahead. Oh, actually, there's another participant who did. Okay, Jason and then Marit.
So, well, can everybody hear me? Yeah, I'm unmuted. Okay, good. So, Abbas, thanks. That was great. Wonderful summary. And just to highlight for everybody, something that you said, I mean, it's super important to study languages that are not potentially studied as much as others. So, this work and the body of your work over a sustained period of time, it has been, really helpful to understand generalities and of course, differences in context, even though, you're looking at some potentially in North America, how, Arabic is potentially different from some of the patterns you see of the more commonly acquired languages as heritage languages there. So really great talk. I have a big and some little questions, but a bigger question of where I'm going. So I'll start with the bigger question, and that is, this is fantastic. And one of the things I like most about your work is the dedication to the crosstalk that can be between theory and looking at heritage languages and how they really can and do and should inform each other. And we agree on that. But there's also a lot of description when we come from a theoretical tradition like we do, right? And I think, sometimes we jump terminologically, as I have issues with to words focusing on things because we expect certain outcomes, right? So, but since we're left with description, and this is true of all of our work, we're lacking potentially as a whole the why, right? So even if we could reduce something to interface phenomena, the question becomes, well why, right? And is core really easier than than interface things? What really are we talking about? We're talking about interfaces. But I want to ask you if you think that when you look at what you've presented to us, and I started to think about this early on in your talk when you were talking about relative clauses, the extent to which we could get to the why this is the case beyond the descriptive interpretation. So if we take relative clauses for a second, right? One thing that strikes me when you're looking at something like relative clauses, or let's say passives or particular structures, is the extent to which heritage speakers might differ for certain things, because certain things are not necessarily equally either relevant or prevalent to them in the context of their input. And one of the things that I've enjoyed about looking at Brazilian Portuguese in particular is that this context, the context of Brazilian Portuguese itself, allows for something that's difficult in certain languages to do. And that is, we could look at sets of monolinguals who lack education, particularly in the language, and therefore degrees of metalinguistic knowledge that might happen, or exposure to structures that are part and parcel more of a particular type of input, like relative clauses and passives and other things. And you couldn't say that about agreement when it's so prolific. But I wonder if we should expect that looking at all types of properties might have different reasons for why they contribute, even if they happen to be at interfaces. But maybe it's because lots of things we consider at interfaces are really not part of the core of the grammar, but of a particular version of a grammar. So I don't know so much about Arabic, but looking at the socioeconomics of certain Arabic countries that map nicely to Brazil, what's been surprising to me, and we haven't even published all of this data, but some of it, a lot of the things we see in heritage Brazilian Portuguese is also true of monolingual Portuguese Brazilian speakers that tend to not be described in the literature. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that.
Oh, wonderful question. Thank you so much, Jason. So I see if I can, allow me to break down your question into two parts. One is about the issue of the varieties we are looking at, the context of acquisition, the speakers themselves, the learners themselves, absolutely. And this is why the work of Nadine and others, your team there, your colleagues there is so critical, because doing some comparison with the European context would be really interesting, because the demographics are a bit different of these heritage speakers. So that would be really an interesting thing to look at. The issue of input is because one thing you zero in there in your question is the issue of input, and this is a big issue even for first language acquisition. How do you get to the input? How do we know what kind of input kids are being are getting, and how we go from that to say, okay, this is why this is learned at this stage, and things of that nature. That is still an ongoing issue, and it becomes even more difficult for heritage speakers, because you get the issues of bilingualism and all that, and also because of the number of speakers that we can study. So there are those challenges, but the input issue is really so critical, and whatever we can do to do more, to look at both the speakers and their socioeconomic status and the language context, the density of the community is so critical. For example, in one of the papers we post on this, one thing that we found, we thought this was remarkable, but probably it's not so remarkable. In some areas, for example, we found Palestinian speakers doing much better than, let's say, other heritage speakers of Arabic. Now, that will be really interesting to study the community and to see why, for example, some speakers do better than others. And that's maybe go to your point, Jason, here. What your question really gets into, and I think that is really important. So we need to look at that. Now, with regard to why, actually the why, I feel like, in some parts we can, and I didn't get to it, but we can, I alluded to it. For example, the areas that we defined are different, are the areas where you get an almost like Fodorian sense, that are not linguistically encapsulated to some extent, where you need, but in a more nuanced way. And that is, you need input from other domains. You need pragmatics the pragmatic input. And the question is that what kind of pragmatic contexts, heritage speakers are exposed to, for example, are they exposed to different contexts? That's probably not the case. And that might account for the mapping issues that we see in many cases. because when we look at native speakers, we are looking at a richer context in general. So there is also knowledge of pragmatics that inform how some patterns are put together and how they are interpreted. So there is this kind of, like, I would call it extra linguistic information that seems to be playing a role in the mapping, whether it is the semantic component or the morphophonological component. And so the interfaces, what is the nature of the interface? And this is the part that is really needs to be studied more closely in generative grammar. What do we mean by interfaces? For example, what are their properties? What are their components? And that probably will get us to the why. Because, you know, I seem to agree that, in fact, a stripped down version of syntax actually is not a bad idea. But we really need to tease apart the properties of these components, these interfaces, because I think that's where probably the why is going to be. And part of it is going to be that we need this extra linguistic information that maybe heritage speakers do not have access to, and that's why we find these differences between native speakers and heritage speakers. So the pragmatic context input hopefully will help us address the why part as well. But that's a really, really good question.
Can I just follow up really, just very quickly? You know, I agree with everything you said. You know, because what stands out through the pattern, and you went over so many domains and so much stuff, is that, you know, there really is. So from my what I think is a more optimistic view, or at least messaging label of heritage grammars, is that, you know, they are the same, and they're the same when they had to be, right? And that's this reverse engineering, right, where there really isn't an option. And that might tell you a little bit about what's core, right? So, you know, but you know, where you see differences, of course, you know, one other thing that I would add is, you know, and this is terminological, but I think, I think terminology is important. Heritage speakers are native speakers. They acquire the language in a native way. So what you really mean by native speaker is a dominant speaker of the language who has grown up in a context where all of this, not just extra linguistic in the sense that's still linguistic in nature, like the pragmatic context, but the context of the packaging of input and what might be reduced in that sense in terms of relative frequency for pragmatics to kick in the same way, and for it to be relevant. And so, you know, I think it's remarkable that across all of the things that you show, my conclusion would be, of course, that there really is a complete and very sophisticated system, of course, that's universally governed and compliant. And where you see these differences are in potentially the context where there is suppletive information that's not just linguistically suppletive information that leads to a chance for conformity within the monolingual native speakers we tend to focus on. And then, of course, within this larger group, you know, ACFA is, the V is for variation. What we really know is that there's a lot of variation that then standardization takes, allows you to eradicate. Like, you know, everybody notices that I speak differently from Vince, who's also American in our group. And I say things that, of course, are weird, but only when I speak, not when I write, because I have had the context in which, if you ask me, I will give you a standard interpretation or a standard approach. And we have to remember that heritage speakers, that's what they lack, that they also are native speakers, but they lack that opportunity potentially. And then not all do, like you mentioned, because we could say, even just looking at Spanish, and I'll shut up in a second, but looking at Spanish for the past 9 years that I've been in Europe, in European contexts, it's very different, but the context of Spanish, of course, is very different here. You have much more potentially isolated communities where things distribute differently. And of course, the status of Spanish is very different in the context of Europe, where it's just a European language, as opposed to all the things that I have to preach about that, you know, in the context.
I think, Jason, we are 100% in agreement. I agree with you on that we need to look at these speakers as native speakers, and all you said about you know, the role of context, the inputs. We need to make sure that we are careful about how we describe these speakers, and that is really based on more detailed ethnographic analysis and all that. I fully endorse. Actually, what I found very interesting about research on heritage languages is that it is raising this question about what it means to be a native speaker. For example, what is core grammar? I mean, this is almost like, the work that Bickerton did as well. I mean, this is like, I mean, I look at these languages, what I say, I see UG, was I was saying to some extent. But the point is that, okay, I mean, we need to make sure that we, as I said at the beginning, make sure that we are comfortable enlarging the empirical base, and that we treat these speakers as also very, very important, contributors to the debate about foundational issues in linguistics. It is not like, this thing, oh, look at these speakers, they are doing this, something that is really interesting, fascinating, it's almost like in kind of exotic way. But it's like, they are really, they are interrogating some very sacredly held ideas in some fields of linguistics, and we need to be really open to re-examining some of those assumptions, and this is why collaboration is so important. I have benefited greatly from working with people who are better at doing this kind of work, doing surveys, doing experiments, doing things like that. My contribution has been very small in that, but it has been an extremely rich learning experience. For the same reason that Jason, we are 100% in agreement here.
Yeah. Now, I just think that the one thing that we could all work on as a group is what heritage speakers highlight for me is a challenge and opportunity for there to be greater acceptance within the linguistic community of variation. And the challenge of heritage speakers and why I think terminology is important is to understand that heritage speakers sitting on a continuum of nativeness allow us or challenge us to be more accepting of the degrees of variation that can exist in outcomes of native grammars, which we also know exists even with dominant monolinguals, but we tend to not focus on it.
Totally.
So that's the case. All right, thank you. I'll shut up.
Mary has her hand up.
Okay, first of all, can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot for a great talk. I like your conclusion. I think it's nice that heritage speakers can acquire stuff, and it's nice that they acquire the core syntax. But I think the interesting part is when there is variation, which you showed for the movement stuff, because when there's variation, you can check what the preference is for the heritage speakers and whether they differ from the people you call native speakers or the ones who are dominant speakers of this language. And I find it really interesting that the heritage speakers prefer the non-movement option here, which seems to indicate that they go for the less complex, the more economical structure. But other people have looked at similar phenomena. So for example, Tanya Kupic has looked at noun adjective order in heritage Italian, and she has found an age difference. So heritage children prefer the simple word order, so adjective noun, which is also similar to the majority language, German in this case, whereas heritage adults prefer the noun adjective order, which is more complex derivationally, and is more Italian-like. And she calls this overcorrection. So cross-linguistic overcorrection on the part of the adults, but cross-linguistic influence from German in the children. Now, Merete Andersen and I have found something similar in Norwegian heritage language spoken in the US for possessive noun word order. So in Norwegian, you can have the possessor either in front of the noun or after the noun. And the word order where the possessor is post-nominal is derivationally more complex according to the standard analysis, but it's also the more frequent word order. And when we look at what the heritage speakers, the more frequent word order in the non-heritage Norwegian spoken in Norway. But when we look at the heritage speakers, we find two groups. We find some speakers who prefer the pre-nominal one, which is less complex and similar to English. And then another group that has a preference for the post-nominal one and use it even more than the non-heritage Norwegian. So they use the more complex structure, which is also the more frequent structure. And we have also used the cross-linguistic influence versus cross-linguistic overcorrection analysis for that. And we find that it corresponds to proficiency in the heritage language. So those who are more proficient in Norwegian actually have a preference for the more complex, more frequent structure, whereas the ones who have a lower proficiency go for the less complex structure and the one that is more similar to English. So I'm wondering, when you say that Arabic heritage speakers do this, who are your heritage speakers? Yeah. I mean, do you know anything about them? I mean, presumably you do. With respect, I mean, how old are they? And what's their proficiency? And do you think it would be possible to distinguish different groups of heritage in your?
That is really, thank you so much, Merit, for that question, and for sharing also the results of the work that you have been doing. Yes, I mean, the most of the heritage speakers we have been working with are usually college students, undergraduate students in American universities. And these are people who have grown up here in the United States or came at a very early age. We haven't looked at the different demographics within the heritage speaker community. And part of it is that really access to speakers to get a critical mass of people where you can look at different demographics, people who have been here early, people who have been here longer, young ones and older ones. But my colleague Abdelkader Barini actually is looking at some of these things and looking at, for example, how children acquire the language and versus adults. But these are really very important questions. I fully agree with you on that one. We need to do more on that. I feel like, we are really just barely scratching the surface of research on heritage Arabic. And this is why the research in Europe as well is going to be even more critical, whether it is in France or Holland and other countries where you get more critical mass, a bigger critical mass of speakers of Arabic as a heritage language, and therefore can probably look at the different communities, different demographic groups, and see what we find. Now, one thing I was going to present, but I didn't, because just for the length of time, and also I wasn't sure whether this is really the context for it, but maybe it is, because one thing, if I were to take your question to, let's say, in another direction, is that this also has something to do with language change in the diaspora. So when you are in a different context, you're getting kind of different input, and then you have pressure from another language in the community, you are going to see some patterns that are different from the baseline. And we do see that. I mean, that's what sometimes fall under, of course, as you know, under transfer effects. But I am looking with the colleague Farooq Akush. This is another area of research that I have been doing, and that is endangered varieties of Arabic. And so we are looking at one variety in Turkey, and what we are seeing there really can inform this discussion about heritage Arabic, because you see some patterns where it is not that different from other varieties of Arabic, but you see other patterns where you become, where it becomes valid to ask to what extent we are seeing here change and the way or change that has already happened under pressure from other languages. And so, for example, we see that in the behavior of verbs and verb movement and negation. We see that in the emergence of a marker in the present tense that you don't find in other Arabic dialects. We have an analysis for it, maybe in some kind of change in the feature system of the language. Phrasal verbs or light verb constructions, things like that, where you see that. So looking at those varieties, even in traditionally native context, whatever the term means, I think can really be informative, especially those dialects that are in some kind of transition. It can be helpful because those dialects at some point are kind of heritage languages as well. It's like the way we are looking at some languages here in the United States that are native to the area, to the areas where you may say, okay, this is somewhat similar. We are seeing somewhat similar pattern, but we are also seeing languages that are farther along in terms of change, linguistic change. So this is another direction I would take your question. And I've been thinking about that to see where we can bring in that research on endangered varieties to this research on heritage languages and linguistic systems and the role of input and the role of input and the role of contact as well. Not sure I answered your question, but it raises so many other questions in my mind. But thank you so much for it.
Could I just ask a quick follow-up? Do you see lots of variation in your data?
Yes, we do. We do. The problem. Oh yeah. Sorry, I didn't answer that part. Yeah, definitely we see differences between the speakers, and we need to go back and look at that more carefully. But you are right. I mentioned earlier, I saw some the differences that we have found, let's say, in some patterns between Egyptian and Palestinian speakers, heritage speakers. No question, there are some differences, and we talk about it briefly in one of our papers, where we say that has something to do with what Jason was talking about earlier, about the community itself. You really have to look at the community, the language, how much the community, for example, how dense is the community, how much the language is used within the community, how much invested the community is in the language, in maintaining the language, and things like that, what resources the community is putting into maintaining the language, and all those things really play a role in this. So there are certainly those differences, but what we need to do is really try to expand the number of speakers we look at, and then drill down more carefully into the data. This is just at the beginning, as I said earlier, and really this is why more advanced research that you are doing, that colleagues here in your institution are doing, is going to be so informative for us as well.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for that discussion. Yeah, Teddy has a question.
Well, I don't know if we're out of time. This is a big question, I think, but I'll raise the question, then you can see whether you want to say something about it. And first of all, thank you for a very interesting talk. And I wanted to ask you about complexity more generally, because we tend, and especially the heritage field tends to use that term very loosely and intuitively. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts regarding how we can do better. I mean, there are so many, if you just look at movement, there are so many different ways of potentially decomposing complexity related to movement, for example, and that arguably goes for a range of other concepts as well. So I have a feeling that we might have come to a point where we can start to do better and just not use complexity as a general intuitive concept, but there's not much work out there trying to do that, in my experience.
Oh, you are absolutely right. You are absolutely right. And frankly, I don't have a good answer to that, because this has been a debate going on since the late 50s and early 60s about the whole issue of complexity and with regard to derivations and deep structure and all that. And so this has been going on for a while. This is why I tried really not to get deeper into that and say more, because I don't think that there is a really good answer to that, at least a good account of that, rather than like what the people used to do, counting steps in a derivation, counting the verb, but that's really, I don't think that is adequate, really. So this is why I try to look more at the complexity of not the complexity, but also really at the interfaces at correspondence, because I think we have a better handle on that. We know, for example, with linguistic constructions where the interpretation depends on other input that you need from the pragmatics or from semantics and things like that, where there are more nuances that you need to add to be able to do that. And also in terms of, depth of embedding, and how, and the minimality effects, the intervention effects that you get. That's what I was thinking about when I was thinking in terms of complexity here, rather than some kind of psycholinguistic measure or computational measure of complexity. So for example, when I was talking about, let's say, construct state and things like that, I said, when you add more steps in the derivation and you see the underlying structure is more kind of, is different from what you see, and then you have many steps in the derivation, those steps are going to require some kind of dependency relations. Okay, and those what we are seeing with heritage speakers, at least some of them, is that there are there are differences in terms of getting to those dependencies. And that's what I was trying to get at. Now, there is another dimension to this, and this is something that you and others have worked on, and Jason and others, and that is the issue of distance. That is, we have in Arabic, at least, we have a better handle on that, because there are some people who are actually doing the research on this. And this goes to the varieties that Mary talked about and the variation that we find here. So the linguistic distance, there is more on it. I had a student who did a fantastic dissertation, a computational linguistics dissertation on issues of linguistic distance between the different varieties of Arabic and trying to measure that computationally. So probably that is an area where we can actually do more on, but in terms of like the whole issue of complexity as conceived traditionally, that I'm not sure. I am more talking about in terms of the correspondence, the mapping to the interfaces. That's what I had in mind. That's a really great question, and we have to be careful with the terms that we use.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Sorry, I think.
Yeah, go ahead, Alexandra.
Oh, I was going to say that I think Gustavo had a question at one point, but I think he lowered his hand. I'm not sure if he wants to go.
I just have something in a few minutes as well, so
yes,
happy to continue the conversation offline.
Yeah, I definitely think that we've gone over time a lot, but it was a great discussion to hear. And thank you everyone for asking questions, of course, and to you for such thorough responses. I think we should end here if there are no more questions, and I believe, yeah, the people can contact you if they want to continue. Thank you so much again for coming, and thank you for a great talk. Another silent applause. And yeah, the Aurora will meet again for something like this next week.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you again.
It was great. Bye.
Bye, everybody.